Gill Paul has authored 13 historical novels, most of which bring to life real women of the past that history has chosen to ignore. Recent works include A Beautiful Rival and The Manhattan Girls, and her upcoming novel, Scandalous Women, a novel of Jackie Collins and Jacqueline Susan, is due out this August. There's a link to pre-order it in the chat if you're interested, and it sounds really cool. She's a lover of vintage fashion, movies, and books, and is all around spanking good fun. So get ready. Kate Thompson, it will not surprise you to learn, is vastly talented, and she uses those talents for journalism in both magazines and national newspaper, as well as writing many fabulous books, both fiction and nonfiction. Her website says that she has over 2 decades of experience, which clearly means that she began sometime in kindergarten.
Oh, but that were true.
She's written best-selling fiction works, including The Little Wartime Library and Secret of the Singer Girls, and nonfiction works such as The Stepney Doorstep Society. Her latest novel, The Wartime Book Club, speaks about the enduring power of literature and of women, which I feel are topics that are likely to speak to our audience here tonight. In this book, we join protagonist Grace, who lives in the Isle of Jersey and works as the island's only librarian. Nazis have ordered Grace to destroy books that threaten the new regime, but instead she hides the stories away in secret and forms the Wartime Book Club, a lifeline offering fearful islanders the joy and escapism of reading. Of course, as the war continues on, this venture gets more and more dangerous for everyone who's involved. I don't want to give too much away, though, so I'm going to turn it over to Kate Thompson and Gill Paul. Thank you both so much for being here with us today.
Oh, you're
Thanks
so
so much,
welcome.
Kristen.
Thank you for that glowing introduction.
I know, wonderful.
I like it.
So, the Wartime Book Club is just the most extraordinary story of courage because it's set in Jersey during the occupation. And what I didn't realize until I read in your author's notes was that this was an occupation with far more Germans than in other countries. You've got 3 or 4 Germans, or 3 or 4 islanders to every German, whereas in France it was 1 to 100, wasn't it? So the
Yeah,
claustrophobia of living there at the time, surrounded by these occupiers, and
yeah.
still managing to have the courage to hide books or shelter a Jewish person in your attic. I mean, I don't know. It makes you think, what would you have been like if you were living in under occupation? It's
Yeah, that is such a good question, John. It's one I've kind of pondered a lot. And firstly, you're right. It was very densely congested or packed with Germans. I mean, Jersey's only tiny, really. It's a British Crown dependency. Not many people know that actually it was part of the British Isles, and as such, one was really one of the only British territory actually to be occupied by the Germans during the Second World War. So you had this massive sort of infestation of Nazis on this tiny little sort of 5 mile long island. And as such, as the occupation wore on, occupations inject poison into the areas that have the misfortune to live through it. And so I think as the war ground on for those 5 long, tedious years, um, people's behavior changed. And actually that very good question actually gives me the opportunity to just share a story if you don't mind. And when I first started researching this book, I put an advert in the Jersey Evening Post with an appeal for stories. And this lovely lady called Jenny Ilian got in touch to tell me about her sister-in-law Doris. And this is what she said. She said, Doris's husband Ray was serving with the British Army during the occupation. So as far as we knew, Doris had lived a lonely, uneventful occupation. But then, one day in 1995, my husband Bernie and I were at Doris's house having tea. The doorbell rang and she asked me to go in. A handsome man in a smart grey suit asked me, is this still the house of Doris? I say, a handsome Frenchman. I said it was the right house. Could I help him? And he said, I'd better perhaps tell Doris to sit down and tell her it was Roger. Tears and hugs followed. To our amazement, Roger told us that aged 16, he'd been picked up off the street in St. Malo by German soldiers and brought to Jersey as a forced labourer. He was taken to Elizabeth Castle where he was forced to break rocks. After many weeks, he saw a man shot for stealing a loaf of bread off the back of the lorry. Before he confessed to the theft, the Germans had shot 3 men and Roger was next in line. That night, he decided to try and escape as he had nothing to lose. The tide was low, and somehow he got to the shore undetected. The first Doris knew of him was when she found this Frenchman in her garden shed. She brought him in, cleaned him up, and fed him. She then kept the escaped prisoner in the house for the remainder of the war and told us that towards the end, with victory in sight, she was worried sick as he kept going into town. She was well aware that she could have been arrested and deported for harbouring him, and after the war, she never breathed a word of her visit. And the purpose of this man's visit after all those years was to invite Doris to be a guest of honour at his daughter's wedding. But as he said, no Doris, no me, no family. We were bursting with pride, and we asked her why had she never told anyone. And she said that after the war, no one would be interested, and she didn't want to boast. And it really made me think, Doris would have carried that secret to the grave had that Frenchman not turned up on her doorstep all those years later. And so my kind of point of reference is, if you like, is always, would I have done that? Would I have been Doris? Or would I have had the bravery to stick my neck above the line and harbour somebody? And I think the honest answer to it is I don't know. I think
I know.
in extreme
I don't think you can know until you've
you
actually
can't
been in
know.
that
No,
circumstance, but it
no.
just sounds terrifying.
Yeah,
And the whole thing, just living, just walking down the road to buy your bread and passing the sentries, and
that's
who
right.
knows what might happen then. I mean, there were different things. I mean, harboring a fugitive in your house was hugely high risk.
Oh
Huge.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, that's the
But
sort of thing that get you deported to a concentration camp in Germany.
yeah, yeah. And you have a section at the end of the book of very sad stories of people who
Yes.
didn't make it. So that threat was very, very real. It happened, and most of them didn't come back, it seems.
Yeah.
But
I think it's just one of those things that you don't know, and we will never know really will what side of our personal morality we would come down on.
mm.
Um, what do you think you would have done, Jill? What would be
Well,
your
reading your book, I thought I wouldn't have had perhaps the courage to get the books out of the library and hide them and start a book club, because there's too many ways that you could be caught. But what I might have done if I was working in the post office is destroy letters. If you could just quickly
Okay.
kind of sneak them off. And
Yeah,
and
yeah.
I couldn't believe it's true that there were letters to the Germans from
Yes. Yeah.
informers informing on their neighbors, poison pen letters, anonymous ones. So they had nothing to gain by that. And I just can't get my head around why would they do that?
Yeah, I mean, that again raises a very interesting thing, and I think highlights the moral quagmire that islanders found themselves living under. In some cases, actually, if this is what I discovered, if the informer was willing to sign their name and kind of go on the record,
Hmm.
they would earn themselves 100 Reichsmarks,
All
uh,
right.
which was a lot in wartime when people were
Yeah.
hungry. But I think the majority were unsigned, and I actually went along to Jersey archives, and they still have some of those letters that were
Hmm.
donated anonymously to the museum archive. And I read, and one of them said, "Sir, I have very good reason to know that Mr. Dark of 9 Belmont Gardens, St. Helier, hears the news very often 8 a.m. Watch where he goes, yours helpfully." And it's the yours helpfully that really gets me, because I just think this is a fellow islander, and they knew fine
Yeah.
well when they were doing that what the sort of they were consigning them to. And I think that story of the postman is a really fascinating example of what I like to call quiet resistance.
Yeah.
Obviously in France, the members of the resistance were blowing up bridges and
Yeah.
undertaking perilous acts, whereas in Jersey, which was that much more densely populated, and it wasn't possible, there weren't these giant forests to hide out in, you were never very far from a German. You
Hmm.
had to do what you could in your own way. So whether it was operating a book club in the library, or opening mail in the post office, those little acts of quiet subversion to me
Yeah.
speak of a kind of formidable bravery. But I love that story of postmen, instead of delivering mail, steaming it open and warning people on their rounds.
Yeah.
And I think it raises another interesting aspect as well, is that, obviously for us in England, because Jersey was a crown dependency and therefore British, it gives us an insight into what it would have been like had they successfully invaded England and we would have found ourselves living under an occupation. It was
Sure.
almost like a sort of blueprint. And I think, in a way as well, that tells us why, it gives us some clue as to why historical fiction is so popular because I think it gives us a safe way to kind of explore the past. You know, what would I do in that situation? How would I have reacted? What
Yeah.
do you think, Jill?
Yes, and also, and you know, you and I probably have relatives who were in that war in different
Mm. Yeah,
capacities, so it kind of connects you to their experience as well. Um,
definitely. Yeah.
but yeah, the book club was a fantastic idea, but I hadn't realized quite how many books were banned by the Nazis. But you start each chapter in Wartime Book Club with a little quote from different banned books. I mean, why on earth was Rebecca banned, for example?
Well, I'm not sure Rebecca was banned. I'm going to have to look
No.
that one up. I thought, yeah, I'll look that one up. But I do know that plenty were. I think it was very easy to fall foul of the Third Reich. And I know that generally it was Jewish authors or anyone who
Yeah.
was critical of the regime or held values incompatible with Nazism. So Ernest Hemingway definitely came up against them. But one of the stranger ones that I found that I was really, you know, this is what I love about history, the surprises that continually kind of throw
Mm.
themselves up. But Bambi was banned by the Nazis, which I know,
Right?
right? Why Bambi? Well, originally Bambi, the original story, which was obviously, as everybody comes to know it, this very sweet story about a
Yeah.
young deer who finds love and friendship in a forest. But the original tale had much darker beginnings as a novel about persecution and anti-Semitism in 1920s Austria. And I think originally the Jewish author's book was banned by the Nazis in 1935,
I
who
see.
banned it as
Right.
Jewish, yeah, propaganda. So he, the author, Felix Sultan, fled Austria in 1938. He then sold the film rights to an American director who sold them on to Disney. And he died, he never earned a penny from the adaptation. He died in Zurich in 1945 alone. And I thought, what a sad
Mm.
tale when you begin to dig deeper. So, yeah, I thought it was, for me, it was a good way of encapsulating the book,
Yeah.
and also just sharing little fascinating nuggets of history and reinforcing, you know, the
Mm.
power of literature.
So, I mean, who collaborated and who resisted the occupation is still, I think, quite a fraught subject, not just in Jersey, in different
Yeah.
countries around Europe. When you were interviewing people or asking for interviewees, did you have anybody that you found who just didn't want to talk about it or who
Yeah,
was torn
definitely.
about it?
Definitely. Jersey is a really, really interesting place. It's an island, like I like to call it, it's like simmering with stories. You know,
Mm.
and you definitely get that feel that after so many years, I think, where are we at? 79 years, the need to share is overcoming the desire to forget. So what I found was it tended to fall into two camps. You had people that were only too happy to be heard and wanted to share their stories, although it was always slightly tempered with things like, what kind of book are you writing? Or I don't know that I should be telling you this, like they were sharing some sort of guilty secret. Or people that just simply felt that after so many years they couldn't do it. I met this lovely lady, and I used to go along to Age UK groups, which is always a great place to meet people and sit and listen to that lovely, lively, you know,
Yeah.
unfiltered gush of history. But yeah, I went and I met this lovely lady, and she heard me asking questions about the German secret field police, which was the sort of equivalent of the Gestapo. And she gave me her address and she said, "Oh, I've got a really good story. Come and see me tomorrow and I'll tell you." So I thought, "Oh, great, this sounds good."
Yeah.
Julie went along the next day and she opened the door a crack and she said, "You know what? I'm really sorry. I can't do it. You can go away and forget the story, but for me, I will just have it going around and around my head." And she closed the door in my face. And I just,
Oh.
so yeah, I really felt saddened by the turmoil because although we look at the occupation as history,
Mhm.
for a lot of people, it's as raw as if it
Yeah.
finished yesterday. I heard a fascinating story actually from a tour guide who said to me that he had that there were these, an old lady, a friend of his, had been taken to a care home. Finally, she couldn't live independently. She moved into this care home, and as she walked into the communal lounge, every single woman in the care home turned their back on her deliberately. And her crime, in inverted commas, was that she was a jerry bag. So it had been
Um,
rumored that she had had an affair with a German during the Second World War. And, you know, memories are long when it
yeah.
comes to things like this. And even 80 years on, she was not forgiven. She had been sent to Coventry. So every time I went on these research trips, I would stumble upon something like that made me feel like this isn't history, this is real and raw, and people's behavior
Absolutely.
is still very sharp.
For anybody watching who doesn't know this, I mean, you are a primary historian. You go out and you talk to people who are now, I guess, in their 80s and 90s, and record their stories either in interviews for newspapers or for your podcast. Or, I mean, you must have hundreds of stories now.
Yes.
What are
Yeah.
you going to do with them all?
That's a very good question, Jill. Well, I started my podcast up as a way of sharing not just the stories, but the voices. I think
Yeah.
people from the wartime years have such a unique voice and language and elegance to them. And it actually came to me as I was interviewing a wonderful lady called Betty Webb, who's 100 years old, and she was
Oh,
a code breaker at Bletchley Park, just incredible. And the voice was like something out of an Ealing comedy, that very
yeah.
refined, beautiful voice. And I thought, I really want people to hear what I'm hearing. And because I always record my interviews, that's how it started off. And now I deliberately record it with a view to a podcast. But anyway, so that started out like that. And a lot of the best interviews that I've done, I've shared via my podcast From the Library with Love. Um, but yeah, you're right. I should think about sort of almost formalizing it into, or category, putting it
Yeah.
into an official archive. I did think about the Imperial War Museum, but I think there would be all sorts of data protection issues there probably,
Mm.
as to why I can't share it. But I think that's, yeah, something I need to really think about, my own
What
archives.
made you start doing this, start collecting old people's stories? Was there one particular person that you met, or was there a family story or something that drew you into it?
Yeah, I mean, my own family, like most families, are touched by the Second World War. It's still within living memory for so many of us.
Mm.
I think it's not, in my family, it's not so much what was said, it was what was not said. So I'll give you an example. My mother's father, so my maternal grandfather, he was a submariner in World War One. He survived somehow a horrific sea battle called the Battle of Jutland,
Oh,
in which
yeah.
many hundreds of men died, and he survived that. He saw many of his comrades die. And then by the time, so he spent the whole of that war under the sea in a submarine, which is hard to think of a more claustrophobic place. By the time of the Second World War, he was still young enough to serve, and so he was
Oh,
made commander of Plymouth docks during the Blitz. He never spoke about what he experienced, like so many people of that generation. And my mum said, and I never had the privilege of meeting him, but my mum said, he just never spoke after the war. And I think in reflection, he must have had severe post-traumatic shock disorder or syndrome. And that's very much the sense I get when I go out and I'm interviewing people of that
yeah.
generation, is that their pain doesn't fade, it festers. And
Mm.
I think in my going out and interviewing so many people, perhaps I'm trying to give a voice. I've never really thought of this properly until you asked me that question. But I think I'm trying to give a voice to my family.
Yeah.
I have this very strong visceral pull towards the Second World War, and uncovering those stories that are often hidden in the margins, forgotten. Like you're the same as me, Joy. You're passionate about that, finding the stories missing from the
Yeah.
books.
Yeah. I had a grandfather who could never be in the house if onions had been cooked because he'd been gassed in the war, and that just brought it back. He just freaked out with the smell of onions. And I was very, very young. I just remember that story. I never asked him about it. And
Oh,
this is so annoying. I have a great aunt who worked for the Special Operations Executive in
no, wow,
London during
really?
World War II. So that was the organization that was airdropping spies to help
Oh,
the
I'd love
resistance
it
in
to be her.
France. And she was
Oh,
extraordinary. She was a linguist. She spoke fluent French, Spanish, Italian. She never married. And I
what
think
a life
I was 19 when she died, and I'd never asked her questions about it. I've got some correspondence. I've got an award that she was given by the Belgian ambassador, some engraved buttons, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm a historian. I write historical novels. Why did I never ask her about this? It's so
well,
annoying. But
you
you know
know,
what, teenagers, well, you've got teenagers. It's
oh,
just like,
listen, you're a teenager.
we're
You're
worried
only
about
interested in
pop
yourself,
music.
and yeah, and looking forward, not looking back. That's so
Yeah,
funny you say that, because when I was thinking of names for the podcast, I wish I'd asked was almost one of the names that I was thinking about,
yeah,
because everybody feels that way.
yeah.
Because it's human nature, isn't it? When we're young, we want to look forward, and it's
Mm.
only when we get older that we begin to look back in some
Sure.
ways.
So
But
you've
that's quite
found
interesting. Sorry, Jill,
the
go on.
nuggets. Sorry, I mean, you've found the nuggets for some of your fiction novels in interviews, in stories that you've heard when you've been interviewing people. How close would you write the novel to what you've actually been told, and would you go back and show them what you've written, or how
Yes,
does that
definitely.
work?
Definitely. I try to be, it's a really interesting question, this, and I think every writer approaches it from a different angle. So
Yeah.
in the Wartime Book Club, I feature the true story of a lady called Louisa Gould, who obviously, as we know, is a real woman. She was helping out harboring an escaped Russian slave. And when she was deported, somebody did denounce her, wrote a letter which was intercepted by the post office. But unfortunately, when the German secret field police turned up and raided her house, the clear up job had not been as good as it could have been. And they found a Russian English dictionary and a wireless. And that was absolutely enough to seal her
Yeah.
fate. And she ended up in Ravensbrück, where she was killed in the gas chambers. A tragic, awful story. And her brother, Harold Ladrilinek, was sent. All he had done was simply be there at the time when she was listening to the wireless. And he was sent first to the Neuengamme concentration camp, and then he was deported to Bergen-Belsen in Germany. And he was the only British man to have survived Bergen-Belsen. So this family have a very fraught, harrowing history. And I thought, look, if I'm going to write about these people and actually include them as real people and have her sitting in the Wartime Book Club, I think it comes, I think the only way I can reason it is I think you have to behave with emotional integrity and
Mhm.
or moral integrity. So I contacted her family, that I knew that there was somebody still living, her great niece. And I said, look, how do you feel about me doing this? And she was very sweet. We went out for a coffee and she said, look, I'm not proprietorial about history. She's my relative, but it's what you write, as long as you research it well, is your version of the past, is your version of Louisa. I don't own her history. And so that was really kind of her, and it kind of almost gave me permission to include
Mhm.
Louisa within the book. So, but yeah, how do you feel about it? Because I often go round and round with this.
I I have a background working in biographies and autobiographies,
Oh,
and I
yeah.
do know that, there's different kinds of biographies. There's the one where you cooperate with the family and the ones where you don't cooperate with the family. And if you're cooperating with the family, they want their version of history, the one that's accepted and probably not too critical of their relatives. And there's certain circumstances when, if it's a public figure, I mean, I would never write about somebody who wasn't a
Mm.
public figure. And I would never, I mean, I don't write about people I don't like. All the women that I write about,
Yeah, that's a very
I
good
feel a
point.
great affection for.
Yeah, yeah. And so actually what you're trying to do is, and certainly as I was in the case of Louisa Gould, is highlight the staggering bravery of
Yeah,
a woman who was just a very ordinary woman. She was a sort of middle-aged matron who ran a quiet country shop, well known to all the people that, went to her for their rations, but
yeah,
utterly unknown outside of that. And I felt that strongly that there were so many stories that have been untold from or little known about the history of the occupation, not least the fact that there were British people who were sent to concentration camps,
yeah,
Nazi prisons, ghettos, who died, the foulest of deaths, and that there were Nazi concentration camps. There was one in Alderney, for example, on British soil. I think that's a very little known fact that there
yeah.
was a SS-run concentration camp in on British
Gosh.
territory, something that Churchill was quite keen to sweep under the carpet after the war. So yeah, I think this is where historical fiction has a role to play in highlighting those stories.
Well, the Wartime Book Club's clearly been very well received in Jersey. You've got this great big long acknowledgements of people that you went
It
for
was as
tea
long as the
with,
book,
you had dinner with, you kind of, you're obviously still really engaged in their life. It's
yeah, no, it was
lovely.
wonderful. I went over there quite a few times, 5 times, and each time, people always amazes me how hospitable people are,
Yeah.
and how if you're interested in their lives, then they're interested to share their stories with you. And I was wonderful. I was invited to people's homes, and one woman cooked me the local dish, which was bean crock, and told me a wonderful story about how her mum had survived the occupation. And then when the British came to liberate the Channel Islands, which was actually the day after VE Day, she locked eyes with this British Tommy soldier, and it was love at first sight. And they got married, and she was born as a result of it. So her
Yay.
liberation love story. So that was really nice,
Oh,
which
that's
didn't even make
brilliant.
it into the book, that one.
But when you're deciding the subject for your next novel, you're looking for different components, you know, a bit of jeopardy, a bit of love, you know,
Mm.
just all the mix that turns into a story with pace and narrative drive. And but then how much are you going to fictionalize, and does it vary from book to book?
That's a real hard one, isn't it? Yeah, how do you walk that line? That is a
Huge question.
it's a good question. I mean, for me, always the easy or the fun part is finding the idea. Like I
Yeah.
love finding stories. You know, for me, tramping the streets and talking to people, having conversations, just open up doors to the past, and that's how the past becomes so bright and vividly real and kind of fires up my imagination. So
Yeah.
with the Jersey story, I found it literally the idea came from seeing a very old plaque on the wall commemorating the work of Jersey postal workers and what they did.
Mm.
You know, when an idea just lands right in your solar plexus and
Yeah.
you know, that's it, that's my next book. Or, for example, when I interviewed a wonderful lady called Pat Spicer, who's now in her 90s, and we were talking about the Blitz in London and how she slept underground in the tube tunnels. And I said to her, "Oh, that must have been horrible, Pat." And she said, "Oh, no, dear, it was lovely." She said, I used to wander up the tunnel and I go into the library and pull out Millie Molly Mandy and take it back to my bunk." And I was like, "What? There was a library
Yeah.
underground?" She said, "Oh, yes, dear, you know."
Here.
Well done, well done. And she said, "Yeah, that little library sparked a lifelong love of reading." And that sentence alone just hooked me in. And I thought, wow. And
Yes.
that's it. So once finding the idea is the easy
Yeah.
part, the execution of it is the part I labor long and hard with. And I think primarily I sort of see myself as a journalist and a social historian first.
Mm.
And the novelist is the bit that I often struggle with because, as you know, that the characterization, the story arc, the narrative structure, that execution of the idea is so complex, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
How do you work it?
Well, I write about women from the 20th century that I kind of want to understand their story a bit better. I think maybe they've been misrepresented in biographies, or, you know, a lot of women were vilified in the past for being too sexual or too
Mm, mm,
ballsy, too out there and aggressive and argumentative, and, you know, qualities that we might admire now, but in the past they were not feminine or whatever. So these are the kind of women that I like to find and read about, and then come up with my own idea of what they were like. And so it's biographical fiction in a sense, but I do fictionalize bits as well, but try to keep it emotionally true to who I think they were.
yeah.
So
No, you're right. That emotional truth or that integrity of truth it counts for a lot. I think as long as you hold yourself to account with that, you're doing them justice.
yeah, but do you know what? If ever anybody else, I mean, my latest one, Scandalous Women, which you mentioned,
Yes.
is about
It is an amazing.
Jackie Collins and Jacqueline Suzanne. And I didn't know either of them. I know quite a few people who did know Jackie Collins, and I have to say, I've never heard a bad word about her from anyone. She sounds incredibly professional and just the nicest of women. So I wasn't worried about writing about her. There's you know, because she just seems very warm and approachable. I think both of them did an enormous service to women novelists by getting out there in the 60s and breaking down the barriers about what women could write about. And it was quite scandalous at the time that they started writing these raunchy, I mean, not even particularly raunchy by today's standards, but, you know, writing about liberated women who had sex lives. And they had to stand up and defend themselves against literary critics and in TV chat shows, and they got hate mail from
Wow.
religious people, and even the feminists disapproved of what they were doing at the time. So they were getting it from all sides, and they just stood there and they fought their corner and they said, this is a story, it's entertaining, it's about women's lives with a bit of glamour thrown in. And they sold their books in the millions.
Didn't know
And I
that.
think they just opened up what women could do as writers. And I think I
I
admire them a
loved
lot for that.
I absolutely loved Scandalous Women. It bathed me in that kind of nostalgia of being. I think I was about 16 when I read my first Jackie Collins, and it felt so daring. And kind of raunchy, and I
Did
just
you steal your dad's
loved.
one?
No, I think I got it from the library and
Did
read
you?
it under the covers with the torch. But it was your writing just took me back there and it bathed me in that wonderful feeling of
Oh,
being
bless
a
you.
young woman and just stepping into the, the threshold of a new
Yeah.
world. You must
I
have
mean,
done
I
a lot
also
of
wanted to
writing
write
about
about it from within the publishing company because, so I made up a fictional character because it was so misogynist. It was so male dominated in that era. And it was most writers were men, all the publishers were men, and the women were their secretaries, sort of booking
that.
lunch dates and whatever for them.
Yeah,
And,
yeah.
I think partly because of the two Jackies, that kind of turned around over the next couple of decades so that the industry is now dominated by women, hugely dominated by women,
There
and
was that
more women that
staggering.
way more women than men write books as well now.
That's true. And you included that staggering scene. Was this true where one of the young interns, I think, or writers back then had a fireman's pole in the office?
Bernie Geist Associates in New York, he did have a fireman's pole down from one floor to the next,
Oh
which
my
is a
goodness.
scene that appears in, I think, the first Bridget Jones movie. But that actually happened in Bernie's office in 1960s New York.
Yes, I can believe, and a lot
There
more stuff.
I mean, so the character that I made up there is kind of, I realized as I was writing it, it's the most autobiographical thing that I've done because I did move from Scotland down to London straight after university and I got a job in publishing. And it wasn't the 1960s, I hasten to add, a
Mm,
little bit further on than that. But yeah, it felt very different than it
yeah.
does post Me Too. I'm
Did
not
you
going to
encounter a lot of
mention.
misogyny then in that world? Because
Oh,
whilst
yeah.
you were doing that, I was working in Fleet Street.
Yeah. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, where
That was
certainly
notorious for it. Yeah.
yeah. Although there was a certain grudging respect for women, like I was often sent to places where it was felt that I would get an in through the door and that I would have a better chance of talking
Yeah.
to somebody. So I was always sent on what they used to call the death knocks, which is a horrible,
Oh,
yeah.
to
Or
get a photo of the person that died and
yeah,
oh,
or just to get an interview, or go and speak to somebody at their most raw, and it was, or go to courts and speak to people as they're coming out of court. That it was a real training ground in many ways, working
mm,
in Fleet Street in the kind of 90s as to what it was to find and understand true stories and understand that there's nothing so extraordinary as real life.
I know.
So yeah, it was.
I mean, what we both do is take these real life stories and weave them into a novel shape. And that's the tricky bit, really, isn't it? Because you need to get that narrative tension. You need to get a story shape that, real life isn't shaped like any real life's random. And so it's the selection of what to include. And then do you
Absolutely.
ever read any of these books like Save the Cat and Anatomy of a Story? And you know,
Um,
I just don't find they work for my kind of novel because I
no.
think they work for certainly for crime or things where you have to have a big reveal. But
Yeah, I
I've
think they're much
read a
more
few.
suited to crime books, aren't they? The only one I've read was Stephen King's book on the craft of writing, which was sort of part memoir, part, giving his
Yeah,
tips on writing, and it was just incredible. I absolutely loved it. And it was more actually of weirdly like a sort of manifesto. Whereas I think a lot of those other kind of books are very much in part instruction manual, like how
yeah,
to write, where to do your reveal. This is what all books must have a component of this, that, and the other. And I just
yeah.
find it sort of turns me off when I'm being told what a story should include. I think they're very good, like you say, for crimes and thrillers, but
Mhm.
for historical fiction, for other kind of writing, I tend to go more on instinct. But
Yeah.
you're right. I think I always do, and most writers do need this reminder of jeopardy, when to do the gear change, how to keep people engaged. And I
Mm,
always try to remind myself that. And I reread Stephen King's book every so often because what I loved as well about his book was just reminders of the traps and the mistakes that we can all fall into. He had a great section on how on adjectives, and I love an adjective. I sprinkle them way
mm.
too liberally. And he said you need to think an adjective is like a dandelion in a garden. One dandelion in a garden is quite pretty and nice, but a whole lawn smothered with dandelions is just off-putting. And the same is true of adjectives in writing.
Yeah. No, he's right. Although I have to say, there seem to be a lot of dandelions this year, and I think a whole lawn covered in dandelions is quite pretty. But yeah,
But yeah, exactly. There shouldn't be rules. You shouldn't, and if you want a
yeah,
dandelion covered lawn and it works for your story, then go for it.
yeah. Yeah,
But
no,
yeah,
there's certain things that the stakes have got to be high. There's got to be. I went to a writing group before I had my first novel published, and we each every week you read out a chapter, your first chapter of whatever you were working on, and the teacher was quite harsh. And after I read out the first chapter of my work, he turned to the class. He said, "Does anyone care what happens next?" And it was, it was quite
Brutal.
devastating. And the discussion started, but I went away feeling really bruised by this. And I thought afterwards, no, he's absolutely right. You have to get to the end of the first chapter and care
Yeah,
what's going to happen next. And otherwise, you haven't got a book.
that's true. I mean, that is bruising advice, but yes, that is true, isn't it? I often try to remind myself that the best advice or the best writing advice is to read more,
Yeah,
because the more
always.
I read, the best writers are readers, aren't they?
Yeah.
And ones that read widely and outside of their genre. And I try to train myself when I'm reading now, not just to lose myself in the enjoyment of a good story,
Mm,
which obviously you do want to do, but every so often you'll find a sweet spot, like somebody will have written a piece of dialogue or
yeah.
a narrative device or some piece of prose that just stops you in your tracks. And I try to just photograph it with my mind and think, okay, what was it about that made
Mm,
that book so special, or that just stopped me and I fell in love at that point with the book?
yeah.
What happened there? What did the writer do? And what can I learn from that? What can I put
Mm,
into my own writing? But it's a craft, isn't it? And we're evolving and learning all the time.
yeah. And I mean, do you write reviews at all? Because I think we're very critical, aren't we, of, what other people are doing. But
So
I mean, I'm
I
very picky. I try to only read books that I know I'm going to love.
Yes, because life's too short, right?
Yeah,
I've always got multiple books because you've got your research books. I've got stacks of them
yeah.
behind me for the current work in progress. But then I've always got a book on my Audible. So as I'm driving or cooking dinner for the kids' tea, I'm listening to that. Then I've got a book by my bedside. There's never enough hours in the day for the books you want to read, though.
No, I know. I've got a wish list I keep on my computer. Whenever anybody mentions one that sounds fascinating, I'll look it up and I'll add it to the wish list. And yeah, you'll know it's never ending. I'll never get to the end of that.
Did
But
you
yeah, no, I mean, like you probably, I just had a childhood obsessed by books, and there's loads of photographs of me sitting with my head
always,
buried in a book.
always with my head, but my nose buried in a book? I remember going on a boating holiday once with my family, and on one of these sort of narrow boats, and we were drifting up the Norfolk Broads, and it was beautiful outside. And I don't think I came out from below deck the whole holiday. My parents got really frustrated. They're like, "Come out and look at the scenery." But for me, as a kid, I was just obsessed with Enid Blyton. Things like that. Anything where children behaved in ways that I would have loved to. I would have loved to have run around a treasure island or an island
Yeah,
off the coast of
with no
Dorset.
adults, no supervision.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. That, or Black Beauty, or also I was always obsessed with books and I realize now that this kind of references the Little Wartime Library, worlds within worlds, secret
Mm,
doors to worlds. I loved The Secret Garden. I loved The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe.
yeah.
The concept that a wardrobe could have a door in the back of it and step
Yeah.
into a world. And in my mind, actually, when I was doing the Little Wartime Library and discovering this library that was underground, 78 feet below ground, built over the tracks, where unusual things popping up where they're not supposed to be, finding a secret door to a whole other
Mm,
subterranean world. Anyway, I'm waxing lyrical. I can go on about that.
yeah. Yeah. And we should also tell people that you have a ghost in your house, talking about secret worlds.
I knew you were going to bring that up.
Well, no, it's fascinating. I'm really dying to come and meet him, actually.
So
Although you said he talks to he communicates with teenagers.
yes, yeah. So just to quote about, I live in a very old house. It was built around 1750. It's grade two listed, and in the kitchen we have a huge bread oven. And so obviously this is how we know that the house used to be a baker's. And when we bought the house, the lady we bought it from, and it was after we'd exchanged, so it was too late to back out. She said, "I should tell you that the house is haunted." And I sort of gulped and I was like, "Oh, right, okay, why is that?" And she said, "Well, her teenage daughter, who was there at the time, was a very beautiful young woman. And she said, when she goes into the kitchen late at night and it's dark, quite often someone will smack her on the bum or she'll get a pinch on the bum." And I went, "Oh, wow, really?" And she said, "Yes, we know it's the ghost, our friendly ghost." And I thought, blimey, okay. And then we moved into the house. Not once has anyone pinched my bum in that kitchen.
Oh,
So I'm beginning to doubt whether it's true, but no, apparently that is there was somebody did a bit of research into it actually, and who they think this ghost is the fire to the bread oven. The job of keeping that fire lit and getting up very early in the morning and getting the bread oven up to temperature, like the red hot heat, would have fallen to probably a 14 or 15-year-old boy called a journeyman, whose sole job was literally to keep this ferocious fire stoked all night. And I think the boy that was doing it was 15 or thereabouts, and died of influenza or some sort of, condition associated with that. So the house has got a very long history. Lots of souls have walked through this house. The steps to the front door are quite worn down. And I love, for somebody who's in love with history, for me, of course, I could feel it sort of soaked into the walls. But the ghost has not quite made themselves known to me yet.
He doesn't materialize, no.
No, not yet.
Oh, amazing, amazing.
Yeah.
Um,
And you and I, Jill, actually, I have to ask you this because we did an event recently where we were exchanging tips, weren't we? About our sort of favorite writing tips. And I'm thinking to ask because I love yours and I've been trying some of them. I think one of the ones you said was whenever you get to a really emotional scene, was it read it out loud or write it all in first person so that it contains
both of
much
these.
emotion? And I just want to say thank you for that because I have started trying that and it really does work.
Yeah. I've just written the work that I'm working on at the moment. I wrote the whole thing in first person just to see how that would work. And then I decided I didn't like it and had to change it to third. And that's really hard. You keep missing all these I's and me's all over the place, but hopefully I'll catch them all in the end.
Did that change, but therefore did that change the overall tone of it? Did it feel more personal, more
It does
immediate?
feel more personal when you write in first person. I think it just allows you to dive in a bit deeper and put yourself in their place and think, what would it have been like to be in that situation at that
That's
time?
try that. That's although you are doubling your workload by
Yeah,
writing it first and
absolutely.
changing it to third.
I know, I know, mental, really. And also, yes, I do always read out loud because otherwise
Oh, it's
you don't
totally
always spot the clunky sentences that are
yeah,
repeated,
yeah.
phrases that are repeated and so forth.
Totally. The way that we write is completely different to the way that we speak.
Yeah,
I'll read it out loud and change vast quantities of the text because it is
yeah,
so different. You're right, the texture and the feel of it is utterly different to just writing something.
yeah.
I
Then
always
you
get
sound a bit mad, this kind of sitting all day in your office, kind of reading out your
the
own book. But hey,
oh, my kids are used to it. I'm always rambling on in here in this office.
Kingsley Amos used to get his wife to do it for him, but my
Oh,
partner's
really?
not that cooperative, I don't
Oh,
think.
oh my. Good tips, though. I like it.
Kristen was going to come and tell us if there were any audience
Yes,
questions, I
I've
think.
just seen the time, actually. We've been talking for quite a while.
There
Before.
we are.
Great if anyone's got any questions.
See, I didn't have to play the award show music or anything. You guys were
We were waiting for it. We were nervously looking at the clock.
Yeah.
So we do have some questions that I will pose to you guys now. We'll see if we can get through all of them in the time that we have. The first one that came up was first a compliment that this attendee loves both of your books, which good taste
Oh,
attendee. Thank you, Jay Coker, for your for your fine
thank you
taste.
very much.
What's the most exciting part of the writing process as an author?
Jill, do you want to go first?
For me, it's just when you're totally immersed in the story and you can feel it, and it's very hard to describe. There's a kind of magic that happens when you're right in there and thinking about nothing else, and ideas just come in a magical way, as if from the universe, really. There's a book by Elizabeth Gilbert called Big Magic, which she's written about creativity, and it's very interesting. It's maybe a little bit more woo-woo than I would be, but she really does think that ideas are out there and we have to
Really?
channel them through ourselves. Yeah.
Oh, I
And
love
they'll come
that.
to you at the right time. But sometimes it just feels like that magic moment when you've got a plot problem and you sit and you concentrate and there it is. There's the solution. I love that bit most.
Oh
How
my
about
God.
you, Kate?
I've never heard of that book and I'm so buying that. That sounds incredible.
Big
Um,
magic.
yeah, Big Magic. Okay, good tip. For me, it's when I'm researching and I've I just get I get energized by research. So a couple of weeks ago, I came back from Germany. I've been researching a non-fiction book which I'm writing in conjunction with one of Britain's oldest Auschwitz survivors, a wonderful lady called Renée Salt. That story is going to be coming out in America next year and England. And I've been following and retracing her footsteps. And I went a couple of weeks ago to Germany, to the sites of her persecution. And just being in Bavaria and Hamburg and Munich and Bergen-Belsen, where she was liberated from, stepping on the ground that she trod on, gave me a connection to her in a way that I could never have got had I just remained here at my desk. So getting out and about into the landscape, like the times I went to Jersey or going to the East End and interviewing elderly Cockneys, or going to, former concentration campsites in Germany, brings it alive for me. And that's when I know I'm doing the right thing. I'm treading the right path. Definitely.
To kind of piggyback off of that, you spoke earlier about the story of the woman who sort of turned you away, and really felt she couldn't share her story, because it would just keep going around and around in her head. And then also the gentleman that never really spoke of his experience, of the war after he returned. So I wanted to ask, how, when you experience that kind of rawness with the people who went through it firsthand, how does that inform your writing about this point in history?
Oh God, in every way, because it gives you an understanding that a lot of what is often what's not being said, that it shapes the narrative. That so much of stuff was left unsaid, that so much was repressed and swept under a carpet, and there was this tautness and strain to life after the war, and that everybody was desperate to look forward and not back. And I think that does kind of, I hope it gives your writing an air of authenticity, that not everybody was discussing and was open, and that there was just great rawness and sadness to a lot of life. And I think that has to imbue your writing with a sense that I think the biggest compliment that someone can pay you is when they've read your book and they say, I felt like I was there. I was in the tube tunnel with you, or I was standing right beside your character. And I think that just having that information, just building that up and layering it in lots of visceral ways into your writing, just makes, I hope, makes you a better writer. I hope. What do you think, Jill?
Absolutely. Yeah. No, I mean, it's the layering of information is I don't work quite in the same way, because, I try to be quite light with the amount of research I put into my books, and it's more about story and character. But
As it should be, as it should be. That's my sort of add-on to loving research and it being my favorite magical thing, is that you can
yeah,
over research.
no, you
Sometimes
have to do the
it's more.
research and then sort of put it away somewhere and just
Yeah. I think our brains are like little filing cabinets, aren't they? Every time we go away and do research, we store it away and we compartmentalize it. And you forget that you know these things until you come to write it, and then suddenly you open a drawer and it pops out.
yeah. And it makes you really good at pub quizzes, doesn't it? Yeah.
Yes.
So another of the questions that we have, and I'm going to piggyback sort of two on this one, is, are either of you working on new novel ideas for what comes next, and what historical period are those set? And then, Kate, I'm also interested to hear a little bit more about the nonfiction work that you're working on right now.
Yeah. Okay. So just briefly, the nonfiction I'm working on, like I said, it's in collaboration with a 95-year-old Auschwitz, well, Holocaust survivor, and her story is coming out in America next year. It's going to be called "Do Not Cry When I Die," and that's going to be timed to come out on the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Bergen-Belsen, so concentration camp. So that's very much almost near completion now. And then I'm thinking about what next. I think I will return to fiction after this. I think it's nice to step in and out of both camps. So I'm going back to fiction. I'm thinking about a story that I've uncovered based around another library. I love books about books. I can't get enough of them. And I've discovered an incredible little library in London that might be, that I need to formulate.
Ooh.
That might be my next attention turning to that next. What
Oh,
about you?
interesting.
Can you
Is
say
it a wartime library, your next one? Your little library? Is it?
it might be, although
Oh,
I've,
okay.
yeah, but
All right.
it is a wartime library, but I've also found another one in Poland, and I'm thinking about a dual narrative and a time hop as
Oh,
well. So we're moving it on a little bit, hopefully.
okay. So you're
What
quite
about
well
you?
on and you're thinking about it. Yeah.
Oh, there's never a short of ideas. Like I said earlier, it's just the execution of it and the time.
Well, I've written, I mean, Scandalous Women is 1960s, and I've also written Jackie and Maria in the 1960s, and I do absolutely love that era. I like the 20s and I like the 60s because they were both decades when there was a real generational change where young people were going out there and shocking their parents, and so you've got automatic dramatic tension there. So I've been writing, in fact, I'm sort of quite well on with writing another one set in the 1960s. The problem for me is because I do include some real people in my novels, I have to be very careful of the libel laws. And, because for people from the 1960s, there are some still alive. So that's you know what? If I ever need a second career, I know a lot about libel now. I could probably do the bar exam.
There you go. That's your fallback.
Yeah, yeah, that's my fallback. Definitely.
So on the subject of hanging at the 20s and the 60s, and Kate spends more time kind of in the 40s. My mom has a saying that history repeats itself because nobody listens the first time.
Yeah.
Oh,
Uh, and so
big tie from both of us there.
yeah. For better or worse. So one of my questions is, what are some of the strongest parallels that you see between the women that you're writing about, for you, Kate, in the 40s, for you, Jill, in the 60s, and women today in the situations that we're facing, and just who we are and kind of our identity?
Oh gosh, what a
Well,
question.
women still face, I talk to young women and they still think they've got to wait for a boy to call them. They can't call first. Do you know that the great sex divide is still, there's still a kind of, guy who sleeps around is a bit of a lad, and if a girl does it, then she gets called all sorts of names. That there's absolutely no way that this battle is over. It's ongoing in the present day, I think.
I'd say there's just not a book that either Jill and I have written that doesn't have direct parallels or resonances today. Like, as I'm writing about book banning and censorship, then I turn on the news and I see that there's a library that's banned Anne Frank, or the censorship is as prevalent. It's changed its form, it's changed its shape, but the fact is that there are still books being banned and censored, as there were, under the Nazi regime, as there is again now. So
Mm.
that's frightening for me to see playing out. And then the book that I'm writing now, the nonfiction, it's funny you asked that, because one of the questions that I asked Rini today was, this 94-year-old woman who suffered 6 years of, survived the Holocaust, suffered the most horrendous persecution, lost most of her family. And I said, do you think we've learned? Have we learned? And she said, no, mankind, we think we're so intelligent. We think, with all our technology, but we haven't learned. She said, I turn on the news and I see little children around the world suffering, and I'm reminded of my own persecution. And she's like, no, we haven't learned anything, sadly, you know. And what can you say to a woman like that? It's true. She still suffers. And, she said anti-Semitism is worse than ever. There are still wars. Mankind seem condemned to keep repeating the mistakes of the past. I think your mother is right.
Mm.
I'll tell her that. She'll be very gratified that you.
Oh, I agree with her. I agree with her wholeheartedly.
Mm.
Now you spoke about some of the best advice that you have gotten as writers is to read.
Mm.
So this is a two-parter for both of you, which is, what is a book that has changed you? And then what are you both reading right now?
Oh, that's a really good question.
It changed me.
So many books have changed. When I think about books changing you, I tend to think back to my childhood books, because that falling in love with reading is what made me a writer.
Mhm.
So again, I go back to, to Little Women, to Secret Garden, to the Enid Blyton books, to Wind in the Willows, all those beautiful
Yeah.
childhood books those were the books that changed me. And I'm
Mm.
currently reading The Paris Daughter. Actually, I'm not reading it, I'm listening to it. I'm very much enjoying it. And before that, I had a bit of a gear change. I read Shuggy Bain, which was just incredible.
Oh, did you?
Yeah, I loved it. Did
Oh,
you read it?
goodness. No, I haven't. No.
You'd like it. For dialogue and characterization, oh wow. It just crackles off the page. It's incredible.
Fantastic. Um, Books that changed me. The first thing that came into my head was Gloria Steinem's The Revolution Within, which came out in the 1980s. And I just absolutely loved Gloria Steinem. She just seemed to be speaking such good sense at the time. And when I just started my first job and felt, how do I negotiate this world of work? And I felt an imposter syndrome, that I shouldn't really have been there. And it's a book about self-esteem, about women standing up for themselves. And yeah, that was very influential at the time. She was great. And right now, this is terrible. I'm reading a book about, hopefully you guys will be able to help me. It's Ursa Major. It's a book about music in the 1970s, and I've completely forgotten the author. Um, that's terrible, isn't it? It was recommended to me the other day because it's kind of loosely based on the story of James Taylor and Joni Mitchell.
Oh, is this a
Something,
research book for a next?
no, just for
Just an
fun.
enjoyment book.
I used to have a crush on James Taylor, so when somebody mentioned it, I thought I need to read this.
But that Gloria Steinem book, you recommended that to me, Jill, some while ago. It's actually on my TBC pile to be
Right.
read next to my bedside. So might have to go up to the top of the pile. But yeah, I remember you talking about that before.
Yeah. Um, and what else? I've just finished Eve Chase, The Midnight Hour is coming out in June, and that is stunning. That's absolutely stunning. And
Read
she
it
does something
before.
that's really, really hard to do is she writes really well about teenage lust in Notting Hill in the 1990s. It's not racy in terms of, do you know, what happens and what goes where. It's very hot. I think it's a great book.
Oh,
And she always has these twisted family secrets that have to come out. So it's structured in a kind of thriller style, but I really recommend that one.
oh, that sounds a good one. That sounds a good one. I read not so long ago, almost as a research book, but Sweet Francais. Have you read that one? Written
Oh,
during the war, yeah, by a Polish writer. It was meant to be part of a sort of three-parter of books, but she obviously towards the end of the book, she was captured by the Nazis. But she writes so beautifully and vividly about the fall of Paris and all the Parisians like streaming out of the city. It's got a little bit of parallels in All the Light We Cannot See. Have you read
yeah.
that one? Right,
Yes, yes, yes.
that's another extraordinary book. I
Mm.
absolutely adored that. I love that book so much. Gosh.
Kristen, have you got any recommendations for
Yeah.
books that you're reading at the moment?
Oh my gosh. I just finished Under the Whispering Door by TJ Klune, which was just an absolutely heartwarming read, and sort of a meditation on grief, in what was like how heartwarming and humorous can you be when you're talking about someone who has died, but it just really was just so full of human warmth and,
Oh, wow.
not ever taking a moment for granted, and it's never too late to change and things like that. So that's my current recommendation. I'm appreciating these recommendations from you because I'm a little bit of a book hangover right now where it was so
Oh
good.
no, really? That's awful.
I'm like, oh, I just don't know if I'm ready to dive into another.
Yeah, yeah. When something's been that good, you're a
Mhm.
bit spoiled, aren't you, after that?
Yeah, I need a moment. So we have two more brief questions if you ladies have
Okay.
time.
Sure.
Yeah, no, we got time. It's fine. I'll speak. But yeah, sure.
Yeah.
One of them is, has there been any interest in adapting any of your books into a series or screenplay? Because there seems to be an ability to totally see and visualize a screen version, which I can totally get behind. And if you haven't, I'm going to call Netflix right now.
Who's that for? For Jill or for me?
Well, yes, I have had a couple of books optioned, and we'll wait and see if they, it's a long process from when they option the book to whether anything eventually happens, but it's very exciting. And I'm talking to a screenwriter tomorrow. I'm not going to write screenplays myself. I'm leaving it to the experts, obviously. And, yeah,
Oh,
but no,
Jill,
that
I
is,
keep my fingers crossed. It's a long road, isn't it? But
oh
it sounds
yeah,
like you're on it.
yeah,
The start of it, anyway.
yeah.
Oh, amazing. I had well, I've had some interest in the Wartime Library from a screenwriter who is looking at adapting it. He's a really nice guy, and we're just kind of in early stage talks about it. So he's putting something together. We'll see. We'll see. You try not to get your hopes up too much.
It would be perfect.
The
That would work
dream,
really
the
well.
dream is Netflix, isn't it?
I mean, I think it's only a matter of time, honestly, myself, but
Oh, here's hoping, hey.
Yeah.
I did write my very first novel, The Secrets of the Singer Girls, got optioned. That was like 10 years ago. And I just remember thinking, oh my God, that's it. I've made it. Wow, that's incredible. And then it never went anywhere. And then it just sort of fizzled out. It was quite a good learning curve to not get your hopes up
Mhm.
too much.
Yeah.
Um,
I
yeah.
imagine it's somewhat like publishing for the first time as well, where there's a lot of learning curves in terms of dealing with editors and publishers and things like that. Like you don't just necessarily land an agent and land a publisher and land a perfect editor, the first manuscript
Oh
that
my
you
God.
send out into the world.
Yeah, there's so many things that people don't tell you, and that's why it's great to make connections with other writers, and it's wonderful.
Yeah.
I've got Jill, and we have our writer lunches, and of course we talk and we learn, and that's actually how you learn a lot about the industry because there's so much that you're just not told about, or you don't understand the way things work.
Yeah.
You know, and even after years and years in it, am I still learning and
Well, it's
understanding?
changing as well.
Well, it does, exactly. It evolves and changes. Just when you think you understand it, you don't. It's a strange beast, isn't it, publishing? But we
And
love it. Why else would we do
Yeah.
it?
Oh no,
we love
absolutely.
it.
It's
And
a, it's such an honor, it really is, to write a book and put
Oh
your
my
thoughts
God.
down on a page and somebody wants to read it. That's just, I can never get over that. It's wonderful.
No, same, same. I did so badly at school, woefully badly at school. I came out with
Did you?
one. Yeah, really. My son's doing his GCSEs right now, and it's giving me nervous. Just seeing him
Oh,
revising and taking those exams is just reminding me of the terror that I felt taking exams
oh
and how much
gosh.
I hated school and hated taking exams. And really, it was only reading and the library that I felt, or writing stories was the only thing I felt I could ever do
Mm,
in a way. So yeah, to be able to make a living out of it is just
extraordinary. Yeah.
beyond, yeah, it's an enormous privilege.
that brings me to my last question for the evening, which is what is something that you both wish you had known about writing novels when you were working on your first book?
That is such a great question. Who came up with that?
Yeah.
Look at that.
Oh, golly.
I've not dared to read mine back actually. My first novel, The Secrets of the Singer Girls, I almost can't bear I'm not brave enough to read it back, I think. I think looking back, it would probably be, that old adage, show, don't tell.
Oh, yeah.
I think there was a lot of that going on, explaining heavily. I think I hopefully I've kind of removed, well, I at least I'm aware of it now.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think I marched headlong into that in my first novel.
Yeah.
And over, that whole thing of information dumps. Now
Mm,
I'm beginning to understand that less is more when it comes to research. And that's been a hard learning curve. Like I don't know if Jill probably heard me say this anecdote before, but the Little Wartime Library, I think I had a review that said something like Kate Thompson or Thompson has really done her research. And I thought, that's really good. That's nice to be acknowledged. And then she went on to say, and doesn't she want us to know it? And I was like, oh, ouch.
so rude.
And I thought, you know what? Learn something from your reviews. I always feel that
Oh, gosh.
there is often information to be pulled out of it. And I thought, yeah, that's right. I probably a lighter hand, a sprinkling
Mm.
research is better. And I think in my first novel, I probably wanted everybody to know that I'd spent a long time in the archives, and that might have come through. What about you, Jill?
In my first novel, I made the plot too complicated. I set up a really mysterious situation where somebody had disappeared and there was a wartime and a present day plot. And I hadn't figured it out. I hadn't plotted ahead. So I got to four-fifths of the way through. I thought, how am I going to solve this? How am I going to tie everything up? And of course, when you haven't planned it, you've got so much exposition you've somehow got to get out in the last few chapters, and it's really clunky and obvious when you do it that way. So, yeah,
You
don't
you
make
do
it too complicated.
Do you do more plotting now then? Like I always ask people on the podcast, are you a plotter or a pantster? Do you tend to go in advance or do
Yeah.
you go
And
as you go
I've
along?
just changed with the latest one that I'm working on, where I did just write to see where it went. But normally, when I'm writing about real people, I've got certain facts that I've got to get in, and I've got to follow a timeline of their lives. So I do tend to plot that, but then I write a very long, like 30, 40, 50,000 word outline. So
That
that's,
helps actually then, because you've got a really defined structure, haven't you?
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And then you can let the magic go off and where it wants to once you've got your building blocks in place.
Yeah, but when you've got lots of real facts and real
Yeah.
timeline to fit in, you need to plot a bit, I think. You do as well, don't you? Or,
Oh gosh, yeah, yeah, yeah. I always, well, in the book I'm writing now, it's non-fiction, so there's
yeah.
no, you have to write what happened. You got, that in a sense makes it much easier in some ways. Um, so yeah, but no, even if I was writing fiction, I still tend to have a sort of scaffold, and I know
Mm.
the beginning, and I know the middle, and I know the end. Where does the jeopardy come in? What's the ultimate outcome? What are the themes of the book? And
Yeah.
then once you dig into it and your characters become more real and fully fleshed out, then they can get up and walk off the page and do things that surprise you and let the magic, as it's called, come in.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah.
Oh, well, that's fantastic. So, all that really remains for me to do tonight then is to thank you both, Kate and Gill, for joining us. This has been a fabulous conversation and illuminating in so many ways. I also want to remind our lovely guests to purchase the book, many books that we have discussed this evening, and keep an eye out for the ones that are coming up in the future, as both of these lovely authors have works on the horizon. Thank you so much for joining us tonight at RJ Julia for this talk. And
Thank you.
Thank you for hosting us. It's been wonderful.
Brilliant. Yeah.
oh, what a blast. All right. Well, thank you very much once again. And everybody have a good night out there.
Take care, everybody. Good
Bye.
night.